I'm Dane Rose, Chairman of Happiness Data, and thank you for watching this exploration of 10x nonprofit. So let's focus on the positioning of a nonprofit, because if you, I, and a group of people are getting together to champion a cause, the premise of that championing is that human beings and sustainable well-being will be in a better place as a result of that cause being championed. Now, some causes are more fundamental in the hierarchy of well-being. For example, if the oxygen on the planet is threatened and the rhinoceros population on the planet is threatened, the oxygen supply is more fundamental to the survival of the entire planet than the rhinoceros supply. Both are important, both correlate with well-being in one form or another. But if there is no oxygen, the rhinoceroses die along with every other thing that needs oxygen on the planet. If there are no rhinoceroses, the rest of the planet does not collapse with the depletion of rhinoceroses. So it's important to be mindful of this pyramid of hierarchies of priority, number one. Number two, it's important to be aware of the risk factors in the hierarchy of priorities. And what I mean by that is the supply of oxygen on the planet is more fundamental than the supply of rhinoceroses on the planet to sustainable human well-being. However, if the oxygen on the planet is 85% robust and the rhinoceros supply on the planet is only 1% robust, even though it is less important to address rhinoceros supplies in terms of global well-being, it is more urgent because, going from 1% to 0% rhinoceros, that's the end of a species. And so one of the things that we need to think about in the goal of facilitating human well-being intelligently is the entire pyramid of crises and threats to survival and the security of survival, the kind of the fundamental priorities, and stratifying these priorities into groups. And what I mean by stratas is it's hard to say if the world was covered in volcanic ash or there was no more forest, and either way there's no oxygen, those kind of go in the same strata. Being hit by an asteroid and, 80% of the world's population being decimated of all species is in the same strata as, being covered in volcanic ash and 80% of the world's species or more being decimated. So the threats need to be correlated and grouped based on how much of the globe's species are affected by those threats. So that's the first strata, is how all-encompassing is the catastrophe to Earth's ecosystem. The next level of prioritization within those stratas are which things are most urgent based on priority, meaning there's no cause that we can imagine that, enough volcanoes would go off and, and cover the Earth with ash. And then on the other hand, what's the statistical odds of, being hit with an asteroid? So models based on data of the probability of any given disaster occurring. And using Stephen Covey's model in the quadrant of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you have things that are very important and not urgent. You have things that are very urgent and very important. And you have things that are not important and very urgent. And you have things that are not important and not urgent. And we tend to always easily focus on the things that are urgent and important. Unfortunately, we often focus on urgent, unimportant things. And unfortunately, we often neglect the things that are very important and not urgent. So this is the main pivot that we're wanting to adjust, to focus away from things that are urgent and not important and towards things that are very important and not at all urgent. So having our model, and this is something that we can work towards as an industry based in part on votes and opinions of, of anyone who has an interest in the topic as to what are the things that are most urgent and most important in terms of generating sustainable well-being. And part of this equation is the return on investment, meaning if something is urgent and important and $1 creates 10 units of sustainable human well-being, and you have another thing that is urgent and important and $1 creates 0.2 units of sustainable well-being, you've got more than 100 times more return on investment for the former, which makes it a higher priority in the goal of effectively responding and tackling to human suffering. An important distinction along these lines is also, when talking directly about human suffering, between prevention and response, meaning there's so many cases in the ecology of suffering in which preventing a trauma is 10 to 100 times more efficient than healing a trauma once it is enacted. That the cost of preventing incest is 100 to 1,000 times more efficient than the cost of responding and healing the wounds of a repeated incest survivor. And so if we keep as an overarching principle that of investing minimum energy for maximum result, maximum human well-being, with the discipline of mathematics to actually continually measure all the forms of energy invested and all the forms of well-being generated, and include within that, thoughts and distinctions about prevention versus response, levels of urgency, levels of comprehensiveness in terms of a strategy that reduces suffering by 2% for 1 billion people is more potent than a strategy that reduces suffering 50% for 1 person. The total units of well-being of 1 billion times 2% versus one person by 50% is it's millions of times more potent. So these are some of the thoughts to think about, and the takeaway from this, I think, is that we need a mathematical algorithm, and we need to start pooling thought and input in the nonprofit and public sector to prioritize not only areas to focus on, but within the areas to focus on, to measure who is capable of transferring and transmuting energy into human well-being within that area most efficiently and thus most sustainably.